Welcome everyone to the April 16th, 2018 Kubernetes SIG Apps. My name is Matt Farina and I'll be chairing today. And so to kick this off, can you all hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Awesome.
Yep.
All right, to kick this off, I will go ahead and share the meeting minutes and agenda into chat here. If you go to this document, you'll see we've got planned out or space for planning for a few more weeks. So scroll down till you see the highlighted green April 16th. It's an easy way to find it. We highlight the one. So we have a couple of quick announcements here. To get going. First, there's the Kubernetes application survey that the App Dev Working Group is putting on. The deadline is currently this coming Thursday. So if you haven't taken it and you deal with apps or you know people who would be great to give us their 2 cents, please share it, please take it, please feel free to post it in every venue, because this data, which will be publicly available to everybody afterwards, can help us all. And so the richer the data set, the more useful information we have to pour through. And then the other thing is the 1.11 feature freeze is April 24th. And so that's coming up here in 8 days. And so we wanted to give everybody notice if there's a feature thing that you need to deal with. The feature freeze is coming up here shortly for 1.11. And so with that, we have a demo of Scaffold. Matt, are you on to give us the demo?
I actually think Kim's gonna do it.
Oh, Kim, you're gonna do it?
I'm gonna give it my best attempt here.
All right, fantastic. Sorry, Matt's name was next to the line item, so that's why I expected it to be him. So with that, the floor is yours. You can share your screen. You can start talking.
Okay, here we go. Let's see. Okay, so good morning, everyone. For those of you that's morning, we released a tool called Scaffold about a month ago. It's open source right now. Can everyone see my screen? Yeah. So right now it's under the Google Cloud Platform organization in GitHub, and so Scaffold is a cool tool that lets you develop locally and iterate on your development and build images and push them to a cluster that's either running locally or one that you've configured, provisioned in the cloud. And so we developed it so it's composable, so you can kind of pick and choose which tools you want to use to run with Scaffold. And today I'm going to show you a cool little repo that one of my colleagues built that answers a very important question. What do developers like more, cats or dogs? And so this is a Node project that uses App Engine, some PubSub, the Cloud Vision API, and some storage. And so what we did is I cloned this repo and I configured Scaffold. And so if I pull up my terminal here, you can see I'm in the repo now. So the way you get this working is you make a scaffold.yaml file, and mine looks like this. And so you configure the build and the deploy stanzas. And so my build is building 2 images, one for my worker and one for my web. And then it's deploying, here's my deployment manifest, and it's actually running to my local Minikube that's running. So you can either run Scaffold in Scaffold Dev Mode or Scaffold Run Mode. So if we kick off Scaffold Dev Mode, this will sit here and listen to my file changes. And as soon as I make a change and save it, it'll kick off a build. And then you can see the changes. So if we run Scaffold Dev, and then we'll go, I got the code running, and the code's up in Visual Studio right now. So what we're going to do is, while this is booting up, is we're going to fix a bug in my code. Right now it says Cloud Turtles, and we want this to say Cloud Cats. So I will show you. Maybe I should have ran this first. It takes a little bit for the first build attempt. Other than Scaffold Dev, you can also run it and run a command just called Scaffold Run, which will run it one time. And so we see this being used in like the CI/CD build steps. Scaffold Dev is great for local development. There we go.
Right now, it's just building the Docker image the first time. After this, and all the layers are cached, the next build will be faster.
Then we also see that I'm running Minikube locally, so we can see that Minikube is up and running in this other terminal too. I hope. It was 5 minutes ago. Anything I should show while we're waiting for this?
We talk about like the features, visibility and stuff like that. They don't need to see the image builds actually happen the first time.
So if you look at the repo, we have some of the features listed out here, if I can find them. I was just looking at them. Okay, here we go. So one of the cool things about Scaffold is there's no server-side component. It's all running locally on your machine. And like I said, we detect the changes in source code and then automatically can build, push, or deploy your images. We handle tag management. And so you don't have to worry about tags anymore. This is one of the things in my colleague's repo or my colleague's project that we're going to be looking at, is he was doing everything with some bash scripts and some ugly templating with the tags. And so Scaffold basically replaces all that. It makes it much cleaner. And then like we support existing tooling and workflows, so we didn't want to be prescriptive about tools that people are using, and so it works well with a lot of different tools. And then deploy it when you save files or just when you want to run Scaffold run for one-offs. And we're still building.
I got a quick question. Do you guys have a Docker file here, or is it just detecting that it's Node.js, or what's the?
Yeah, so there is a Docker file. This is the repo that I'm building off of.
There's one in web.
Yeah, there's two. There's one in web. So there's a Docker file here, and there's also one in the worker directory.
Yeah, one nice feature to note is that we, in the latest Scaffold release, we have support for non-Docker builds. So we're still not doing any resolution of where of actually creating Docker files for you. But you supply the Docker files, and then we also have a Bazel builder, which can build images using the rules Docker rules in the Bazel repo. And we're hoping to extend more kind of non-Docker builders like Image and Builda and all these other tools that help you build images without a Docker daemon.
Cool, thanks.
Any other questions while we're still waiting for this to go?
Well, we see what the weight is. You had it's a Node.js app with 735 packages. That can take a little while.
I do have a question here.
Go for it.
Yeah. So basically, so you mentioned that for CI/CD processes, how do you integrate the flow? So I don't get the flow if I want to integrate it in my build pipeline. So because I get the use case when you're developing, and then the image built automatically. But what is the flow when I'm building in a CI/CD system? Thanks.
So, do you want to answer this?
Yeah, so the idea behind that would be, so right now we publish a Scaffold image so that you could run this in like a Google Cloud Builder pipeline. So the idea would be you do some setup with your app. You have a GitHub trigger that triggers GCB. And then somewhere in your pipeline, you run a Scaffold step with it, which actually just takes your repo, builds the image, pushes it and deploys it to your cluster. And then after that, you can have steps that do, check if the deployments are up or do whatever kind of extra steps that you need. So we envision Scaffold as being kind of a step in a Jenkins or a Spinnaker or a Google Cloud Builder pipeline. It's not nearly the whole story. There's no triggers. There's no pipeline definition per se. So that's kind of where it stands in the CI/CD world.
You can see in the repo, in the Scaffold repo, a few examples, and under the getting started. Let me find it. There's you.
Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. You can see, maybe it's not there. There's an example showing how you can build and push to like GKE, for example.
Yeah, so I saw it, but my thing is, so I get that it's so from what you said, I get that this is post-testing method rather than you test before you actually deploy to the cluster. So in this use case, you deploy to the cluster, and then if you want to do testing, basically in staging or queue or whatever, then you do that. But is there kind of like in-build testing before you actually deploy, which is also automated? That's something that's actually my question, or where my point. But I get completely what Scaffold is doing. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess could you elaborate a little more on what you would be testing? Are you testing like the image itself because it's not deployed yet, or what, the test to your application, or?
So basically what I expect, for example, is before I actually deploy, so there's an intermediate step that says, okay, the application is running correctly. If you look at container structure tests, also from Google Cloud Platform, there's some interesting tests happening there. So what I would expect, for example, is something interim in between, before deploying and after building, to run these tests to make sure that the image is actually containing what I want it to contain, including commands, environment variables, resources, whatever. It's behaving structurally correct, and also I can do runtime tests. That's
Yeah. So we're actually the team that also publishes those that repo. So integration there would be pretty easy. But I do see what you mean. Structural test and kind of functional test to your Docker images. So I mean, does that belong in something like Scaffold? Possibly. If we were to add a kind of intermediate step in between build and deploy, it would probably have to be pluggable, just like build and deploy. We wouldn't really want to force users to use container structure test, even though I think it's a pretty great product.
I mean, you can also say instead of scaffold run with dev, you can say scaffold whatever. Which this is a task that like Gradle does it, for example, and this includes an interim testing. If you don't want that, then don't run it.
Yeah, we've been a little hesitant to add kind of the escape hatch of just a task runner in any of these steps because at that point that kind of opens up the floodgates to a lot of things you can do, which is good and bad sometimes. But yeah, having somewhat of an opinion of what the API looks like, but not saying exactly what the implementation would be.
So to jump in here real quick, for those of you who are interested in task runners, Antoine and somebody else, I'm forgetting the name right now, have been working on one, and it's one of the things we're looking to line up once they're ready to have a demo here. Also, just a question, the repo, CI/CD-for-the-win CI/CD appears to be private. There's been a little discussion in chat about it, and folks asking if you could share the source. It may not be something you can do now, but that's a request.
There is a, so Justin Beckwith, I don't know if anyone's heard his name. This repo is public. There's a few modifications, and I was trying to figure out what he changed between this one and this private repo, which I can give back to everyone on. But you'll see this is the public one. There's no scaffold.yaml in this one. And I think there might be something with the credentials that is different from the private repo to make the demo actually work. So, okay, it looks like we are finally up. So now Scaffold is telling us that it's watching for changes. So if I go and run my Minikube, this is the only way I know how to do it, service list. I can get the IP address of where this is running on my local machine, I think. Wait for it. Uh-oh. No. What does that mean, that?
Maybe you broke it.
I broke everything.
Too many NPM modules.
Did I kill it?
Of this.
Okay. Anyway, now this thing is on it. Okay, so this is what, if I were to pull it up and you could see what's actually running, it says Cloud Turtles. And so you could go in the code and change this little bug and make it say cats, save the file, and then Scaffold's going to pick it up. And Scaffold is not going to pick it up because it closed. You want to show a different one?
No, that's fine. I mean, we can move on.
Yeah, the beauty of live demos, things tend to break when you go live in unexpected ways. This isn't the first time. No,
We really need it healthy here.
so if I understand it right, it would be if I were just related, if I were, creating like a Jekyll, and in Jekyll I said to watch, and every time I saved a change, it regenerated whatever it needed to, and then it was available, right?
Yes.
And so here it would regenerate based on the changes, because you have a whole bunch of stuff already cached locally, such as your NPM modules and your image layers. It's actually pretty fast because it only has to regenerate the one small part of it. Is that right?
Yep, you got it.
Okay, so it lets you do that inner loop. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Well, sorry about that.
It happens. It's the live demos. They're always interesting. All right. Did you have more things you wanted to show us about Scaffold, or did you want to take questions now?
I think we're good. I mean, we would love to hear, how people are using this, and obviously we have, we have a discussion, and love to see issues and feedback on it. Something we're excited about. We only released it a month ago. It's been picked up quite a few times already, so we do think we're kind of filling a gap for developers to help them learn, how to write in Kubernetes land, especially for local development, making that a lot easier. So, yeah, I'd love to hear from people.
So I do have a question. The project you started off with had Kubernetes configuration files in it. So if I were a developer showing up with my own code base and I said, all right, now I want to get it ready for Kubernetes, what do I need to provide as a starting point, kind of that day zero configuration to get going using Scaffold when I'm doing something with Minikube? How would I do that?
So I think, is there in the repo?
Yes, I mean that's a good question. I mean that's one thing that if you're going from day zero and you have absolutely no idea of Kubernetes configuration or Docker files or anything like that, a tool like Draft might actually be better suited for your use case, just because they have a lot of the magic that actually takes from nothing to Docker file, Kubernetes manifest deployments and stuff like that. We don't actually do anything there. And it's not really on our roadmap to actually template out any of these deployments or Docker files, because it's I mean, at least for me, it's a very difficult problem, and I don't know if I have a great answer to how you would do that.
So here's an idea, right? If you don't solve it with automation, documentation is a great way to start saying, if you're approaching this, here's where you can get started creating those Kubernetes files. So if somebody does approach it, they're not saying, where do I go and what do I do? If Scaffold's their entry point, they could say, oh, here's where I go learn what I need to go do to create those files and how I lay them out so that it'll work with Scaffold, right? That's just a thought.
No, that's a great idea. I the first time I got this running was actually on a Django project. So I haven't developed in a while, but when I did, I was writing Django apps prior to Google, and that was my hello world example myself. And it was pretty easy just to go from Django to getting Scaffold up to pushing to a GKE cluster. But I think
I can't remember if it was in the SIG Apps or in the community meeting, but I did see a few demos for tools that help with that initial day zero handling your app and generating files. So if people have some of those that we're working on, we definitely put links to them in the Scaffold documentation.
Great. Thank you. No, I like where this is going, and actually solving that inner development loop, save, refresh, see it. That's an important step to get to, and so it's great that we're here.
thank you.
Does anybody have any other questions about Scaffold? Things you want to know? You've got them live here. Ask away.
I do have another question, actually. Sorry for asking too much there. So the question is, you said that there's no server-side components. If I'm getting it correct, you use kubectl or kubectl to actually run your or deploy your app, but you can also have support for Helm, which basically runs with Teller, and Teller is a server-side component. I'm not sure how there is no server-side component in the equation. That is.
Yeah, good. I mean, good point. Maybe that's more of a semantic note, saying that there's no scaffold server-side component, so we're not actually storing any state on the cluster, and the scaffold binary itself is not stateful in terms of configs or anything like that. So if you're using a deployment tool that does have an on-cluster component, then sure, you need that on-cluster component, but we're planning to support a lot of tools that don't, such as kube control, and there's some other tools, deployment tools that don't have that kind of on-cluster state.
Yeah, and I think we're starting to see a shift of tools from having that in-cluster state thing to move more towards CRDs or nothing at all. You'll see that with Helm 3 development and stuff like that. Some of the folks I know who are trying it out found the complexity. So I can understand the desire not to have that. And I think it's a good thing.
Thanks. That's right.
So does anyone have any other questions about Scaffold? All right, then if you do, please continue to ask them in the chat here. Thank you for the Scaffold demo. I love seeing this inner loop problem being handled. This is fantastic. Thank you. So our discussion today actually shifts towards some of the things that we were already talking about here in the Scaffold discussion. And one of those happens to be, the first one in the agenda is image building. And I know folks have talked about other ways of building images. It's kind of one of those things that has cropped up in the space. It used to be you have to get a Docker daemon and then you use Docker commands to build your images. And now we're starting to see a proliferation of tools that enable you to do this, either local tools or services. Many of the cloud providers are now offering a service that says, give us your stuff, we'll build the image for you, right? API driven, service based. And so we wanted to have a little bit of a discussion on image building. And so it's pretty free flowing. We got a number of people here who are interested in the topic. And so there's kind of, there's local image building versus server side image building. There's different tools and services. So the floor is pretty much open on this. Did anybody want to kick it off with a suggestion to talk about or something in particular?
Sure, I got something that I can kick off the discussion. I'm purely curious on if other people, so there's one context that I've heard a very common use case with image building, and that is injecting environment secrets into the image build. So for example, if you're building a container image that happens to need secrets at build time in order to fetch dependencies from, say, like a private service or anything like that, I'm curious if people are currently using that like with Docker, if there are use cases around that, or if people are using alternative workflow tools around it, like say Box or alternative tools around that. So something like that.
Okay, I know OpenShift uses S2I builds, which are kind of like Docker start and commit after, and they inject the secret for private GitHub repositories, usually. So if you want to look at that, there's S2I and OpenShift. I'm not the one working on it, but there are other teams doing that.
Is that like using some kind of bash script around Docker build? So using like Docker start, using a Docker run to inject and Docker commit into there and just doing that kind of whole workflow? Or is that using an alternative workflow tool? I'm just curious about the differences between the two.
It is using the two scripts, assembly and run. The assembly is responsible for doing whatever you want to do with your build, while the S2I is actually running the Docker image, which is usually containing the entire tooling that you need to build your specific application. And the run is then responsible for running the apps. But yes, well, actually, assembly and run can be bash scripts, but they can be actually any other type of binaries that will allow to be run inside of the builder. But the builder image can be multi-purpose, but it's rather a targeted per each environment. But by each environment, I mean more like a specific language they care about.
I think the OpenShift build process also, since it's running in a container in Kubernetes, you can mount secrets into that process where the build is running.
Yeah, and if I recall, the OpenShift build experience is more of like a tooling, not using a Docker file, but that's around like their own custom workflow. So like I know that they do like a build a mount, and then you actually mount into the file system and do injection into the root file system that way.
I can't speak about Builder because I haven't played with Builder myself. But what we have in OpenShift is either you do the regular Docker build where you provide the repo or Docker file itself, or you do the S2I. And the S2I can come in multiple flavors. The simplest being you just point the OpenShift at the sources, and the build process will pick up your application and build it, because by default it is provided with the two build scripts, of course, which you can override or whatever you want to do with it.
Yeah, one place I'd actually like to see this problem solved is actually doing something like on cluster builds and reutilizing the runtime that Kubernetes provides for actually doing the build. And then once you do something like that, you can automatically use kind of the native mounting strategies in Kubernetes to mount those secrets. And then it becomes, you get all the RBAC stuff and all the other stuff for free. So I think as we go down more of a strategy of doing things like that, then we can utilize a lot of the machinery that we've already built in Kubernetes to do something like this.
Yeah, another to follow up on source to image and Docker files, there is a Docker file within the that's used to produce the base layers of this source to image kind of workflow. But usually we split up the responsibility for maintaining that Docker file, and the associated kind of patching around that is usually architects or security teams rather than your front-end Node.js developers. So there's kind of a separation of concerns around who gets access to the Docker file and who's responsible for application security as far as standard libraries, and then a separate, application security for your app code is really developer focused.
Yeah, one thing I'd actually, I mean, we're just starting off these discussions of like developer tooling and SIG apps, and we're starting off a little slow and trying to figure it out, like what topics would be good for the people here at SIG apps to talk about, and what kind of things people are interested in. But one thing that topic kind of brings up a little bit is there seems to be this kind of gap between the user stories of, the operator and the developer, and, who's responsible for the builds, who's responsible for the deployments, what configuration is kind of available to the developer, is for something like Helm is the values file, the API that the developer sees, and the operators are actually maintaining the charts. Do these configurations live in different repositories? Because questions like that really influence how we build out the tooling. I think that might be kind of an interesting topic to talk about a little bit, and very relevant to a lot of the people here who are developing the deployment tools.
Yeah, and some of this is really going to also depend on organizations too, right? If you take operators and developers as different roles, in some small close teams, especially like in a startup, they may be the same people doing both roles. And in other organizations, there's companies who will have 1,000 people working in a single app. It can be huge. And in that organization, you might only have a handful of people doing the ops, while many of the other people are working on, say, the feature development. And so it's really split then. And so I think it depends on company. And so that's totally important roles, and kind of this mishmash of the way so many of us do things differently, taking that into account, I think would be useful too.
That might be an interesting way to split things up, not just on persona, but also on like org style, or if you have like true DevOps, everybody gets access to everything, versus a very siloed organization, which there are still many out there. I think it'd be interesting to frame it that way and say, here's a set of tools or a way to look at things if you have this type of org, and kind of split up like that.
And another one could be probably the kind of adoption level of Kubernetes, because I think what the discussion we just had assumes that we're talking about a user who wants to run their builds in a cluster, and I think that's like 1% of people really. Most people run their builds in a CI system, and they make it work so it produces a Docker image instead of just a binary like it used to before. And that build, maybe containerized, maybe in part containerized, maybe just, maybe they build a binary separately and then add it within a Docker file to whatever base image they use. And, that's like that's the step one for most people really. And what we just discussed was more like mature organization. I mean, in terms of their Kubernetes adoption.
Yeah, I guess I totally agree that there are a lot of different personas here, and each persona and each different size of organization is going to need very specific tooling tailored to their size. But I guess just questions to think about, like should we be building our tooling to be multi-tenant? Should we be building our on-cluster components with kind of RBAC and security in mind? Just because people don't necessarily want to do on-cluster builds today, what's stopping us from making that kind of the blessed path, even for kind of developer workflows? I don't think that those are necessarily wrong things to look at right now.
Yeah, and actually to bring some perspective, like OpenShift does in-cluster builds like by default. And so you can't use Docker build because you need connection to the Docker socket, which is basically like giving root to your cluster. But the S2I, which we talked about, is actually designed so if you build the base image separately and you don't need to install packages, you can run all of this as non-privileged user, like non-root in a container, and you don't need a Docker socket because the S2I will start a container from the base image, run your scripts, and then commit the stuff. So like this is already working in cluster and it's secured, but it has limitations for sure. Like maybe build up will be easier.
And I know Jess Frizzell's image is also non-privileged, so that's another interesting tool to look into for non-privileged builds that could be on cluster potentially. I think with our OpenShift base image layers that are used with S2I, a lot of that build of the Docker file is done before we get it into the cluster to kind of isolate that risk and have that done by admins or whoever's responsible for security.
I had a question, like when I don't know if this has been kind of discussed already, when would you need to start thinking about this? Let's say I have a thing that can build Docker images for me today. Should everybody be going out and figuring out how to build them in cluster, or is there a condition that causes you to raise the red flag and start looking into it?
I don't think that there's any reason for you to worry about that. I think you're already in a good place if you have that. This is something that we're discussing as from the perspective of projects that the SIG and produces and anything related to the SIG and such, right? So from the user's perspective, I don't think there is a big worry about that. If you're happy with your CI system, you shouldn't have to worry.
But I think that figuring out ways to build tools or to build images is important, because there are a lot of people who are building CI processes and CI tooling, right? I mean, how many companies create their own CI processes and tooling based on, starting with Jenkins as a foundation, or Concourse, or Drone, or something else, or Travis, and then they go and they layer in their own processes. DevOps people are devs. And so a lot of us, we like to write our own tools a lot of times. And so having those parts there for people that they can plug into their processes, I think it's really useful, and it's great in the tool interoperability discussions as well.
Yeah, but I'm just saying I don't think users should have to worry whether their builds run in a cluster or elsewhere.
I think that's a good point. At the same time, contrarian to that, there are also developer tools out there that people are building. So for example, like obviously the Scaffold team, ourselves, the Draft team, and other teams out there as well, like who are building CI/CD systems and all that. So to answer the original question of do I use currently Docker build, Docker push, or whatever else, I have my own process in place to build and push images. Should I be concerned, or should I be invested in this kind of discussion? Honestly, I think if you already have that CI/CD tooling system in place, yeah, it doesn't really necessarily move to that, or there's no major benefit to move over to in-cluster systems. However, it is a really good discussion to have around if you're building a tool around CI/CD, or if you're building a tool around development processes that kind of have that inner loop of building images. And so I think that's where the discussion is partially going right now, and I think it is useful. We did do that like in-cluster building step before with Draft. I found there were quite a few limitations actually, or a couple of things that I was a little bit of a red flag moving forward to in-cluster Docker image building for Draft, which was there's kind of a discussion between like, do we want to support in Kubernetes alternative Docker runtimes, or Docker or container runtimes? So for example, there's Cryo that is being built out, that's currently being used in like SIG Node. I think they're kind of playing around with Cryo. And then there's also like Docker a long time ago, and it's still like in conversations here and there, is Rocket. So it was just kind of like there's multiple container runtimes that are being used for the Kubernetes runtime, but we're kind of exploiting that a little bit when we're building these CI/CD tools around that, and we're kind of inferring from whatever cluster that we have available to us that we're going to assume that Docker is available. And I don't know if that's always going to be the case. So that was one thing that was like, okay, it might not be such a great idea to build an end-to-end CI/CD tool, or something that does Docker image builds using Docker in the future, in case hedging against like if, say, the container runtime ever changes inside Kubernetes. I don't imagine it will, or I have no idea if it will. But it was one concern for me when I originally we were building this project out.
So I two ideas on this that just came up. One is, well, where you build your stuff matters a little bit if you're doing local dev. So say I'm on a plane and I'm disconnected and I want to do this loop thing. It's kind of the example we use, especially for some of us who have to travel from time to time, right? When I'm totally closed off. If I'm using a software as a service, that doesn't work. Now say I'm using Minikube and I'm using like Draft or Scaffold, where does my image build happen? Should it happen in Minikube, which, I mean, it's a single node cluster, but should it happen there, or should it happen on my local machine? And then how does this end up working out? And then to combine to that, the thing that I'm starting to wonder here is if you're dealing with services and indirection, is this the kind of thing that should be exposed as a service via service catalog? And then you could have many different implementations behind it, but your end user doesn't have to care. And you could have something in Minikube. If you move to a cluster in Google, it works there. If I'm running in Microsoft, I can use whatever build to service ends up there. If I'm doing it on premise, I can have my own service. And then you work that way, but then something like Service Catalog gives you that indirection, so you, the end consumer, don't have to worry about knowing everybody's API. I don't know, just a couple thoughts.
So my idea here is if we even need the daemon, because like with the builder, you could actually run a container, run the builder or something like that in it, build the image, and push it somewhere. Like maybe we don't even need to assume there is a Docker or something. Maybe when we move forward, like with builder or something that's daemonless and can run in a container with namespaces coming, maybe that should be done just there and no API.
Yeah, one thing that I think that we should be targeting with all of our developer tools is targeting the interfaces that we've created and not the tools, not the hardcore implementations of these. So we shouldn't be building tooling around Docker. We should be trying to target the CRI when possible. We should be trying to target the CSI when possible, CNI, all of that sort of stuff. Because I think going forward, if we build a good set of developer tooling around these interfaces, not only will it make the community kind of a better place, but it'll also be better for the developers of these alternative runtimes, to get some feedback on their tools. And this is something that we did kind of early on with Minikube, by putting Cryo and Rocket and other runtimes other than Docker, so that users kind of had an easier way of trying these things out. But I think that's something that we should be thinking about, kind of across the spectrum now that we have a lot more of these interfaces.
Taking a step back, as a developer, why do I care? What is wrong with what I do today that I need to start thinking about where my builds are running versus just on my laptop and then it goes somewhere as a developer and then I commit and things happen?
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I almost see this as kind of taking that away from the developer or the user. That today the user needs to do their Docker builds kind of out of band, and then provide the image and do the authentication and push kind of all by themselves. But if we could start to obscure some of these details, I think that might be a better way forward. On cluster builds, the nice thing is that you don't have Docker twice. You don't have Docker in your cluster and then Docker and a SaaS or another CI system. As we can start to take away those dependencies and have the cluster be kind of the only dependency for these tools, I think we could make the developer workflow a lot easier.
Yeah, I was going to say something along the same lines. If I don't have to install and maintain Docker on my local work environment, especially if I'm in an enterprise, and a lot of them still lock down a lot of machines, where I've got to deal with that, and I just have the one tool chain that needs to be updated rather than duplication in there, that could make things simpler.
That's handing off more of the responsibility of my dev setup, quote unquote, to the operators, for example, or it may be the same team, but to a different set of individuals other than the developer, and that would be shared.
It could be the difference between I install Minikube or Minikube plus Docker. And now Minikube plus Docker are slightly different versions, the version of Docker and Minikube, and now I've got to maintain updates to all these. It's just one less piece in the complexity puzzle that I have to install and maintain on my system. But otherwise, you're right, it becomes a lot of an ops question.
Yeah, it just seems like kind of deferring some of the responsibility, which is fine. I think it makes sense to do that. I just want to know how many people are struggling with maintaining Docker on their laptop and or Minikube, for example, has the Docker daemon already in there. So if you have to boot up Minikube, you get Docker for free.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'll tell you, I'm one of those people who is not struggling with maintaining Docker on my system.
I am not personally either. I've been using Scaffold a lot lately, and I just don't really think about most of those tools underneath the hood. I'm pretty happy with that kind of source code and then frameworky thing that handles getting my source code updated. So I'm wondering how much people care what's inside of one of those frameworks, or if if that's too restrictive to have something that orchestrates kind of your dev workflow and kind of handles it for you, if it's the right or wrong abstraction there.
So I think independent of with the local developer flow, where someone is iterating on their application and rebuilding it, there would also generally be some kind of CI system somewhere that is doing builds. And those builds are workload like any other workload, which I was trying to post to the chat. And we are increasingly seeing people run those CI workloads or try to run those CI workloads on Kubernetes for the same reasons they want to run any workload on Kubernetes, because it's easier than setting up for VMs or doing something else. And doing builds in those systems right now is kind of painful, because either they need to poke a hole and access the local Docker socket, or and then they may want to create a pool of dedicated nodes for those machines if they are running out on Kubernetes, or they need to do Docker and Docker, or they need to do some other strange hack or use one of these other new tools that doesn't actually require privileges or host access or other things. So I think there is a need for some kind of tools to build images that don't require any special privileges to actually do the build steps for the common kinds of builds that people are doing. And that's just as like something that is very relevant to SIG apps, and that it's just a workload for Kubernetes. And that's kind of orthogonal to the developer workflow, but it's related in that the same tools that would be used for on-cluster CI might also be useful in the developer workflow.
Makes sense.
But as we could see in the demo, another issue with on laptop builds is just the laptop might not have enough memory to run Minikube and a massive build. Like certainly I don't have memory for anything on my laptop unless I kill Chrome.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point, is the resources of doing it. And there are a lot of people who will have a dev environment out in the cloud, so they're not using Minikube, and they might be using Scaffold or Draft or something like that for their closed loop, and it actually pushes the stuff out to the cloud, but their pipe is big enough that it's pretty quick. So they're even able to do it there.
Yeah, I like using Minikube on my laptop for demos because it doesn't require dependency on Wi-Fi, which might be unreliable, but it's only usable for lightweight things like pre-built images and so on.
Yeah, and as users have kind of beefier clusters that they're paying for, they'll want to reuse those same clusters for development, and there'll also be a lot of things that you just can't do locally, so, like some of the machine learning workflows. And so we want, in Scaffold we chose kind of like the kube control context as the endpoint that we're targeting, so that it doesn't just work with something like Minikube or GK or something like that.
That actually brings up a point, and the one that Brian made about things being better, more resources available in the cluster. Is we've talked to some people and they have trouble running their whole stack on a laptop, no matter how big it is. Maybe there's just shared services that they need to reach out to. So that's something that I think we should also look at as we go deeper into the dev tooling, is how do you split up, what each individual developer's responsibility or what things they run are, and what tooling do you have available in order to slice and dice those things? How do you, have a manifest or whatever that says what things you should deploy here, where everything else lives? That can get pretty complex and bespoke pretty quickly.
All right, so I'm gonna jump in here just with a time check. We've got about 8 minutes left, and we actually had one more topic that we do. And so this is great conversation, and we'll pick up with a whole lot more of the developer stuff again in 2 weeks. Next week, we're gonna be talking about the application CRD, and we'll have Kubi Builder in for a demo and some stuff like that. But one of the things that we'd like to do is give tooling that's in the ecosystem and even stuff SIG Apps owns an opportunity to give project updates. And we have at least one thing here. If you go to the agenda, there's a place you'll see Telepresence is there first. If anybody else wants to throw their project in here, we do like to give everybody an opportunity to just share updates, what's going on with your projects. And so if you want to add something in here real quick, you can. And so with that, I really wanted to give Telepresence a moment to give us an update. What's going on?
Yeah, so thanks, Matt. So this is Richard. We're presenting actually to the CNCF TOC tomorrow because we're submitting Telepresence for consideration into the, I believe it's currently called the Sandbox, although maybe it's going to be renamed. So that's a big thing for us. The other thing that we actually have been working on is the general feedback from Telepresence users is that they're very happy with it, but the robustness and performance of it in terms of just starting up and making sure it works with unreliable network connections and that sort of thing can sometimes be challenging. And so we're experimenting with an actual persistent long-lived proxy that runs on the cluster. And that way you can actually have auto reconnect and you can actually have a much faster client startup time. Because right now, when you start up Telepresence, it actually deploys, it does a deployment of the proxy each time you start up the Telepresence process, which obviously takes a bunch of time, and then it sets up all the stuff locally. If you just have the proxy always running, then you can just reconnect to the proxy whenever you get disconnected. So we think this will actually help solve problems when if you get disconnected, Telepresence doesn't clean up after itself, and it will also improve performance and also allow us to support reconnect, which is a popular option for folks who are on Caltrain and have dead zones when they're using Telepresence on the train. So that's the general update.
Fantastic, thank you. Did anybody else who had a project want to give us an update? You don't have to be a Kubernetes project.
I can give a little mini update on draft at least. So 0.13 was released last week, and we're just looking to fix up. There's a couple of issues around Windows support. So like, as you know, with Helm, we kind of integrated with Helm plugins in the same model for how Helm plugins are installed, which is basically you point to a repository which has a hook in there to install the actual binaries if necessary, or it does install hooks. Most of that has been used like as a bash script, so that obviously doesn't necessarily work on Windows without Windows subsystem for Linux installed and if it's being run inside that system. So what we want to do is we want to actually add like PowerShell support in there, so people can actually go and start using Draft and all these other development tools on more than just like Linux and Mac OS, which has been kind of like the status quo for a large amount of the tools being built here. So there's that.
I'll add something on Draft as well. I've been working on task support. So my background is in Rails, and to work with a Rails project in Kubernetes, I'm going to need to do some things like before actually deploying my project, set up some dependencies, and then once I have my application containers running, I may want to run like things like rake commands to set up my database schema and seed some data and stuff. So to do these kinds of tasks, I've been working on a feature called tasks, and so that's in a pull request right now, and finishing with some stuff on that. Yeah, that's it.
All right. Does anybody have any other projects they wanted to share about?
I can give a quick update on Kubernetes.
Sure, thank you.
I think last week we released I think 0.60, which adds support for Helm upgrades. So now you can go in your deployed Helm apps, you can go and upgrade them and pass in new values or point to a new chart version. So that's awesome. And the next big thing that we're working on is auth, so you can log in with a Kubernetes bearer token or service account token, and only do the things that you're supposed to do via RBAC roles. And that should be out by the end of the week.
Great, thank you. Anybody else have anything else? All right.
Sorry. Adnan, for the Helm upgrade support, I'm not quite sure about Cube Apps. Is the repository updating and all that stuff, is that done out of band outside of Cube Apps? Or when the user goes to the browser, are they able to update like the repositories and what the index is pointing to for Cube Apps so they can do upgrades and whatnot?
So Cube Apps has a bunch of cron jobs. Whenever you add a new repository, it sets up a cron job to go and pull from that repository every, I think, hour by default.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also manually refresh it in the UI, and then whatever. So based on that, whatever versions it has picked up, you can go and upgrade from once you've installed a chart.
That's pretty slick.
Yeah, check it out.
All right. Do we have anybody else with anything? Okay, then I have one more thing. Somebody poked me in a side channel about KubeCon EU, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. And one of the conversations they were looking to have is a dev tools. I didn't know whether this should be a BOF or Ken, if you're there. You've been organizing the SIG app sessions there, if we have time for that kind of topic in there. Ken, are you on? Okay, maybe he's not.
And about the,
yeah,
I was. Oh yeah, sorry.
Wait, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, Ken.
Okay. So we want to organize a discussion around dev tools?
Yeah, somebody asked about that in a side channel, about dev tools, and I didn't know whether that would be a BOF that folks should get together on, or if there's time in the SIG app sessions we already have.
I was thinking about doing that inside of the SIG app session for the deep dive, if we want to have a discussion there.
Okay.
I mean, we have an hour, as far as I can tell, an hour and a half for the deep dive. So I was planning on doing something similar to what we did last year, just kind of a brief overview of the overview and get a feel for what people would like to talk about and what they'd like to discuss. I mean, the deep dive is the community's meeting. It's not really like the chair's meeting. So if that's a topic of interest, let's go for it.
Also, perhaps we could submit it for the Contributor Summit as well, which I was thinking of doing. I don't know if anyone else on this call was thinking of the same or done it already.
So because we're at time on the meeting here, and I know folks have to go, can I ask that those of you who are interested in this topic, reach out to Kenneth Owens, Ken. He is co-chair of SIG Apps, and he's organizing the time there. And so if you can reach out to him outside of this meeting, he can help you figure out whether it's something that can fit, whether it doesn't, and just how to approach that, because he's the boots on the ground there. And then, so just for the next two meetings, the next one's April 23rd, which is where we're looking at Kubi Builder, the application CRD, things like that. And then the following meeting won't be until May 14th, because the week of April 30th is KubeCon, and then the following week, it's the Monday after KubeCon. Folks are usually not ready to have conversations about stuff then. And so we push it off. We give that extra Monday right after KubeCon as a day off. So the next one will be May 14th, where we dig into more of those developer topics again. So with that, thank you everybody for coming and such a lively conversation. I look forward to more of them.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Have a wonderful day, everyone. All right, bye-bye.